Sometimes the people who should love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. 3 weeks after Harold Mays buried his wife of 40 years, his stepson changed the locks and told him to leave. At 72, Harold stood on a frozen road with one duffel bag and $97 to his name. He had no family left and nowhere to go. Then he saw an auction flyer for a house selling for $99. He bought it. The house sat alone on a forgotten road, buried in snow and abandoned for decades. Harold just needed a roof over his head and walls to keep out the wind. But when he stepped inside, he found sealed rooms, old journals, and something impossible clues connecting the house to his own childhood. How could a place he never knew existed hold the secrets of his past? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Greyhound bus rattled along County Road 47, its worn suspension groaning with each pothole. Harold Mays sat 3 rows from the back, his duffel bag clutched between his knees, watching the landscape blur past frost-covered windows. Bare trees stood like sentinels against grey February skies. Fields stretched endlessly, blanketed in snow that had turned dirty at the roadside from passing traffic. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's funeral. 21 days since he'd stood at her graveside, feeling the weight of 40 years collapse into a single moment. The preacher had spoken about eternal rest and God's mercy, but Harold had barely heard the words. He'd been too focused on the cold seeping through his dress shoes, the way Gregory stood apart from him, checking his phone throughout the service. Margaret had been his anchor. They'd met at a church social in 1985, both in their 30s, both convinced they'd missed their chance at marriage. She was a widow with a grown son. He was a factory worker who'd spent his life moving from one rented room to another, never quite belonging anywhere. Their courtship had been simple and honest. No grand gestures, just 2 people who understood loneliness and chose to face the rest of their days together. They'd built a modest life in Gregory's childhood home, a small ranch house on the outskirts of Millbrook. Margaret worked as a school secretary until her retirement. Harold kept his job at the metalworks plant, bringing home a steady paycheck that covered the bills and allowed for small comforts. A television, a reliable car, Sunday dinners after church. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability, and for a man who'd grown up in foster care, stability meant everything. He'd never legally adopted Gregory, though he'd tried. Margaret's son had been 19 when they married, already grown and wary of the man replacing his deceased father. Harold understood. He'd never pushed, never demanded the title of father. He'd simply tried to be steady, reliable, present. He'd helped Gregory through college expenses when he could, attended his wedding, sent birthday cards that rarely received replies. The distance had hurt, but Harold had accepted it as the price of coming into someone's life too late. Margaret's illness had come suddenly, a cough that wouldn't quit. Tests that revealed stage 4 lung cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Harold had cared for her through all of it, the hospital stays, the chemo that left her weak and nauseous, the final weeks when hospice set up equipment in their bedroom and time became measured in morphine doses. Gregory had visited twice. The day after the funeral, Gregory's lawyer had appeared at the door. Harold had still been in shock, moving through the house like a ghost, unable to sit in the living room without expecting to hear Margaret's voice. The lawyer had been professional but cold. The house had been in Margaret's name only, inherited from her first husband. According to her will, it passed to Gregory. Harold had 30 days to vacate. 30 days? Harold had repeated, certain he'd misunderstood. My client is prepared to be generous, the lawyer had said. He'll give you 60 if you need it. Harold had looked past the lawyer to where Gregory stood on the porch, unwilling even to come inside. Their eyes had met for just a moment before Gregory looked away. That had been 3 weeks ago. Harold hadn't needed 60 days. He'd packed his clothes, a few photographs, Margaret's wedding ring that he couldn't bear to leave behind, and he'd left. He had no siblings, no children, no cousins he'd kept in touch with. Foster care had scattered whatever family connections might have existed, leaving him adrift in a way that 69 years of life had never quite corrected. He'd spent 2 nights in a homeless shelter before the shame became unbearable. On the 3rd day, searching through community bulletin boards for room rentals he couldn't afford, he'd seen the auction flyer stapled crookedly to a corkboard. Estate liquidation, Sale County seizure properties houses, starting at $99. The auction had been held in a cold municipal building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. 15 people scattered among 50 folding chairs, most of them contractors looking for cheap properties to flip. The auctioneer had been bored, moving through the lots with mechanical efficiency. Most properties had gone for thousands, even the worst needed that much for back taxes and fees. Then came lot 47. 2-story farmhouse, 1,840 square feet, Millbrook Hollow Township, parcel 234512. Property sold as is, no utilities, significant structural concerns. Opening bid $99. No one had raised a paddle. The auctioneer had waited, called once, twice. Harold had lifted his hand, more reflex than intention. Sold to paddle 38 for $99. Just like that, he'd paid in cash at the clerk's window, his last. $97 plus 2 singles. A woman behind him in line had quietly handed him when she'd overheard him counting. He'd tried to refuse, but she'd pressed them into his palm and walked away before he could protest. The deed had been processed that afternoon. The clerk had handed him the papers with an expression somewhere between pity and confusion. "You know this property has no heat, no water, and hasn't been occupied since the 1,950 seconds. "I know," Harold had said, though he hadn't really known anything except that he now owned something, and after a lifetime of renting and borrowing and living in spaces that belonged to other people, that felt like a kind of miracle. The bus jolted to a stop. "Millbrook Hollow," the driver called. "End of the line." Harold gathered his bag and stepped into the February cold. The bus station was just a covered bench beside a shuttered gas station. The town itself looked frozen in time, a single main street with perhaps a dozen buildings, half of them empty. A post office, a general store with a faded awning, a diner with a closed sign in the window, a town hall with peeling white paint. This was the address on his deed, County Road 47, 3 miles north of town center. Harold started walking. The road stretched ahead, empty and white. His boots crunched through snow that had been packed down by occasional traffic but never fully cleared. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees, cold enough that his breath came out in clouds, cold enough that his ears ached within minutes. He'd bought supplies in the city before catching the bus: canned soup, crackers, a sleeping bag rated for 0 degrees, waterproof matches, a flashlight, batteries. Everything was crammed into his duffel, making each step a test of endurance. He was 72 years old, and he felt every year in his knees, his back, his lungs that burned with each inhale of frozen air. After 40 minutes, he saw it. Set back from the road, barely visible behind a wall of snow-heavy pines, stood a 2-story farmhouse. The structure sagged slightly to the left, as if the earth beneath it had shifted over decades of freeze and thaw. Windows on the ground floor were mostly intact, but filmed with grime and ice. The upper windows showed gaps where glass had broken. The porch listed forward, its steps buried in snowdrift. Harold stood at the end of the long driveway, studying what he'd purchased for $99. Paint that might once have been white had peeled away in long strips, exposing grey wood underneath. The roof showed gaps where shingles had blown away. A brick chimney rose from the center, its top courses crumbling. It was, by any reasonable measure, a ruin. But it was his. He trudged up the driveway, each step sinking ankle-deep. The porch groaned under his weight, but held. He brushed snow from the front door and tested the knob. Locked. He tried the key the clerk had given him, old brass, heavy in his palm. It turned with resistance, and the door swung inward on hinges that shrieked. Harold stepped across the threshold. Darkness swallowed him whole. He fumbled for his flashlight, and when the beam cut through the gloom, he saw what 70 years of abandonment looked like. The air inside was barely warmer than outside, and it smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, something old and indefinable. His flashlight beam swept across a front room, furniture draped in sheets, their shapes ghostly in the dimness. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with debris. To his right, an archway led to what looked like a dining room. To his left, a staircase climbed into shadow. Harold moved deeper inside, his footsteps echoing on wooden floors. In the dining room, a table still held place settings, plates covered in dust, glasses catching fragments of his flashlight beam. It was as if someone had simply walked away mid-meal and never returned. The kitchen lay beyond. An old cast-iron stove, a porcelain sink stained with rust, cabinets with their doors hanging open. On a small desk beside the window, Harold's light caught something that made him pause. A stack of mail, letters, bills, all addressed to the same name, Raymond Mays. Harold's breath caught. Mays was his surname. He'd always known that much. It had been on his birth certificate, the one document that had followed him through foster care. But he'd never known who his parents were, never known where he'd come from. The state had told him they'd died in an accident when he was 3, that there was no other family, that foster care was his only option. His hands shook as he picked up the top envelope. The postmark read February 1956. 69 years ago, he set down his duffel and began searching in earnest. The desk drawers yielded more papers, property tax notices, utility bills, all in the name of Raymond and Estelle Mays. In the bottom drawer, beneath a layer of yellowed newspapers, his fingers found something else, a leather-bound journal. Harold carried it to the window where grey afternoon light filtered through decades of grime. He opened it carefully, and on the first page, written in elegant cursive, were the words, "Property of Estelle Mays, 1953. His hands trembled as he turned to the first entry. The 15th of January 1953. Raymond finished the crib today. Our boy will be here soon, and I can hardly believe we'll finally be a complete family. After so many years of trying, so many prayers, God has blessed us with this child. Raymond keeps touching my belly, feeling him kick, and I see tears in his eyes, though he tries to hide them. We have chosen his name, Harold, after Raymond's father. The journal slipped from Harold's fingers. Harold. They had named their son Harold. Harold stood frozen in the kitchen, the journal at his feet, where it had fallen. His heart hammered against his ribs. The words on that first page had cracked something open inside him, something he'd kept sealed for 7 decades. He bent slowly, his knees protesting, and retrieved the journal. His fingers traced the name written there. Estelle Mays. Could this be his mother? The woman who'd carried him, named him, written these words about his father building a crib? The state had told him his parents died in a car accident. No details, no graves to visit, just a clinical notation in his file that he'd glimpsed once during a meeting with a social worker. Parents deceased. No living relatives. Ward of the state. He'd been 3 years old. His memories of that time were fragments, the smell of bread baking, a woman's voice singing, strong hands lifting him high. He'd always assumed these were dreams or wishful thinking, the mind's way of filling in blanks that hurt too much to leave empty. Harold carried the journal to the dining room and cleared dust from one of the chairs. He sat carefully, opened the journal again, and began to read. The entries painted a picture of simple, earnest lives. Raymond worked the farm, 20 acres of vegetable crops and a small dairy operation. Estelle kept the house, tended a garden, sold preserves at the town market. They struggled with money but managed. The entries were full of small joys. A successful harvest, a new dress Estelle had sewn, Raymond fixing the tractor. Then came entries about the pregnancy. Estelle's excitement and fear. Raymond's preparations, painting the spare bedroom, building furniture, saving every extra dollar. The birth in March 1953. Our Harold arrived at dawn, perfect in every way. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that announced his presence to the world. Raymond held him and wept openly. I have never seen my husband so undone by joy. Harold had to stop reading. Tears blurred the words. He'd spent his entire life believing he'd been unwanted, a burden, a child his parents had been relieved to surrender. Every foster home had reinforced that belief. Every birthday spent with strangers, every Christmas where he'd received practical gifts from social workers instead of love from family. But these words told a different story. He forced himself to continue. The entries chronicled his first years, learning to walk, his first words, Dada and Mama, his love of being outside, following Raymond around the farm. Estelle teaching him to count using buttons, birthday celebrations with homemade cake. Then the tone shifted. An entry from August 1955. The drought continues. We've lost half the crop. Raymond tries to stay strong, but I see the worry eating at him. The bank has sent another letter about the mortgage. September 1955. Raymond sold the dairy cows. It broke his heart, but we needed the money for taxes. Harold asked where the cows went. I didn't know what to tell him. October 1955. A man from the county came today. Mr. Sutton, he said, we're behind on property taxes and the county might have to seize the farm. Raymond showed him our payment plan, but Mr. Sutton just shook his head. He said the county needs the money now, not in installments. When Raymond asked for more time, Mr. Sutton looked around our home like he was already pricing it. Harold's chest tightened. He knew where this was leading. November 1955. Mr. Sutton came again. This time he brought papers. He said if we sign over the property voluntarily, the county will forgive the debt and we can stay as tenants until we find another place. Raymond refused. He said this land has been in his family for 2 generations. Mr. Sutton's face went cold. He said, men who can't pay their debts don't get to keep their property. One way or another, you'll be leaving. December 1955. They came today, sheriff's deputies and Mr. Sutton. They said we had 72 hours to vacate. But Raymond checked the dates. We still have 3 weeks until the final deadline, according to the original notice. Mr. Sutton said the timeline was adjusted due to administrative necessity. Raymond tried to argue, but the deputies made it clear we had no choice. Where will we go? What will we do? And Harold, dear God, what about Harold? January 1956. We've been staying in a rented room above the hardware store. 1 room for all 3 of us, barely enough space to turn around. Raymond looks for work every day, but there's nothing. The drought affected everyone. Harold keeps asking when we're going home. I don't have the heart to tell him we have no home anymore. The next entry was dated a week later, and the handwriting was shaky, as if written in distress. The 15th of January 1956. They came for Harold today. A woman from County Child Services said we can't provide adequate care. She used words like neglect and unsuitable environment. I screamed at her that we love our son, that we're doing everything we can. Raymond tried to physically stop them from taking him. 2 deputies held him back while the woman carried Harold to her car. He was crying for us, reaching back, calling, Mama, Dada. I can still hear his voice. I think I'll hear it forever. Harold couldn't see the page anymore. Tears fell freely now, dropping onto the old paper and smearing the ink that had sat undisturbed for nearly 70 years. He pressed his palm against his mouth, trying to contain the sound of his grief. They hadn't abandoned him. They'd fought for him. He forced himself to keep reading through blurred vision. The 20th of January 1956. Raymond went to the county office every day this week, trying to get Harold back. They told him, "We need proof of stable housing and income. We have neither. We're living in one room. Raymond can't find work. They said Harold is better off in state care, that he'll be placed with a family who can provide for him. The caseworker said we could visit once we get settled. But how do we get settled when we've lost everything?" The 3rd of February 1956, Raymond discovered something. He found the property records at the county office. The farm was auctioned the day after we were evicted before the legal deadline. It sold for a fraction of its value to a private buyer. Mr. Sutton's signature is on all the paperwork. Raymond says this is theft, that we can fight it. He's trying to find a lawyer, but none will take the case without money up front. And even if we got the farm back, would they return Harold to us? I don't know anymore. I don't know anything, except that my son is gone, and my heart is broken in ways I didn't know were possible. The entries continued through February, each one shorter, more desperate. Raymond, trying to build a legal case. Estelle, writing letters to Harold at his foster placement that were never answered, returned with "no contact allowed" during adjustment period. Then came the final entry, dated March 1956. "I don't know how we'll survive this." Raymond barely sleeps. He's obsessed with proving the county stole our land, but what does it matter now? Even if he's right, even if we win, Harold is gone. They moved him to a different foster home last week, wouldn't tell us where. They said it's better for his adjustment if we don't interfere. Better for his adjustment. As if being torn from his parents and thrown among strangers could ever be better. Raymond says we have to keep fighting, that we'll get him back. But I look at my husband's face and see the same thing. I feel despair. Harold must never think we didn't want him. That's the one thing I can't bear. Wherever he is, whatever they tell him, I pray somehow he knows we loved him. We loved him with everything we had. The journal ended there. Harold sat in the gathering darkness, holding the evidence of his parents' love and loss. Everything he'd believed about his life was wrong. He hadn't been abandoned. He'd been stolen. His parents had fought for him, and they'd lost. Harold stood on shaking legs and began searching the house with new purpose. If this was his childhood home, there would be more. There had to be more. He found it in what had once been a small bedroom off the kitchen, a child's room, his room. The furniture was simple, a small bed, a wooden chest, a bookshelf. On the wall, someone had painted a mural of farm animals, a cow, a horse, chickens. The paint was faded and peeling, but he could still make out the cheerful colors his mother must have chosen. In the wooden chest, he found children's clothes sized for a toddler, a tiny coat, small boots, drawings on paper so old it crumbled at his touchstick figures labeled Mama, Dada, Harold in an adult's handwriting. On the bookshelf, tucked behind a row of picture books, he found a tin box. Inside were documents. His birth certificate, official and untouched. Adoption papers that had never been signed. And letters, dozens of letters addressed to various foster homes, all returned unopened, all marked undeliverable, or refused by facility. His parents had tried to reach him. Over and over they'd tried. Harold sank to the floor of his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of a life he'd been robbed of. He wept as he hadn't wept even at Margaret's funeral. These were tears for everything lost: his parents' struggle, his stolen childhood, the decades of believing he'd been unwanted when the truth was so different. When the tears finally stopped, something else remained. Not just grief, but resolve. This house held his history. These walls had witnessed his first steps, heard his first words, sheltered the family that loved him. He would restore it. He would honor his parents' memory. And he would find out exactly what had happened to Raymond and Estelle Mays after they lost their son. The light was nearly gone. Harold gathered his sleeping bag and made a space in the front room near the fireplace. Tomorrow he would begin the work of reclaiming his past. But tonight He simply sat in the darkness of his childhood home and let himself remember the fragments that suddenly made sense, the smell of bread, the woman's voice, the strong hands lifting him high. Mama, Dada. He'd been loved. Morning light filtered through grimy windows, waking Harold from restless sleep. His body ached from the cold and the hard floor. The sleeping bag had kept him from freezing, but comfort was another matter entirely. He was 72, not 22, and his joints reminded him of that fact with every movement. He sat up slowly, taking in his surroundings with fresh eyes. In daylight, the house looked less ghostly but no less abandoned. Dust covered every surface in a thick blanket. Cobwebs draped the corners like funeral cloth. Water damage stained the ceiling in dark patches where the roof had leaked, but it was still standing, still his. Harold used a corner of the kitchen to organize his supplies. He ate crackers and canned peaches for breakfast, standing at the window and looking out at snow-covered fields. Somewhere out there, his father had worked this land. Somewhere in this house, his mother had sung him to sleep. He spent the morning exploring more carefully. The parlor held furniture from the 1952, all of it worn but salvageable. A sofa with springs poking through faded fabric, 2 armchairs, a coffee table with water rings marking its surface. Above the fireplace mantel hung a mirror so tarnished it barely reflected anything. On that mantel, he found a Bible. The leather cover was cracked and dry, but when he opened it, pressed flowers fell out, dried and brittle, but still recognizable as daisies. On the inside cover, written in careful script, Raymond Mays and Estelle Porter married the 12th of June, 1948. Harold did the math. They'd been married 5 years before he was born. 5 years of hoping, praying, trying for a child. And when he'd finally arrived, he'd been their miracle. He turned pages carefully. The Bible contained a family record section, his parents' birth dates, their wedding date, and there, in his mother's handwriting, Harold Raymond Mays, born the 3rd of March 1953. Harold traced the letters of his name. This was proof. He'd existed to them not just as a burden but as a blessing, important enough to record in the family Bible alongside their marriage vows. Behind the Bible, tucked against the back of the mantel, he found a photograph in a tin frame. The metal was tarnished black, but he rubbed it with his sleeve until the image became clear. A family portrait, professional, taken at a studio based on the painted backdrop. A young man in his 30s with dark hair and serious eyes. Raymond, a woman beside him, with gentle features and light hair pinned back, Estelle, and between them, held in his mother's arms, a toddler in a white shirt and small tie. Harold stared at his own face from 70 years ago. He'd been perhaps 2 in this photograph, chubby-cheeked and solemn. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder. His father's hand rested on his mother's shoulder. They looked like what they were, a working family who'd saved up for a studio portrait, dressed in their Sunday best, capturing a moment they wanted to preserve forever. Harold's throat tightened. He'd spent his entire childhood in foster homes, where family photographs lined the walls, images of children who belonged, who had history and connection. He'd never appeared in those photographs. He'd been the temporary guest, the boy passing through, never quite part of the story being told. But he had been in a family photograph once. He had belonged somewhere. He set the photograph carefully on the mantel where he could see it, then turned his attention to practical matters. If he was going to stay here, he needed to make the house livable. The temperature inside hovered barely above freezing. His breath still came out in clouds. The fireplace was his first priority. Harold cleared out debris from the hearth, old bird nests, leaves, broken bits of brick. The chimney looked mostly intact from inside, though he couldn't be certain until he tried lighting a fire. He found old newspapers in the kitchen and used them for kindling, adding small pieces of wood he broke from a collapsed section of porch railing. The match flame caught. Smoke rose, and for a terrifying moment Harold thought the chimney was blocked, but then the draft caught and pulled the smoke upward. Heat began to radiate into the room. It was a small victory, but it felt immense. He spent the afternoon making basic repairs. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. He tightened the screws with a rusty screwdriver he'd found in a kitchen drawer. Several windows had broken panes. He couldn't replace the glass, but he found cardboard in the basement and used it to cover the gaps, sealing the edges with strips of cloth torn from old curtains. The work warmed him, and with the fire burning steadily, the front room became almost comfortable. In the basement, he discovered tools that had belonged to his father. A toolbox with Raymond's initials carved into the wooden handle. Inside, hammers, pliers, wrenches, nails in glass jars sorted by size. Everything was rusty but functional. His father had been organized, methodical. Harold felt a kinship with that. He'd been the same way at the factory, keeping his station clean and his tools maintained. He also found jars of preserves lining basement shelves. The glass was thick with dust, the contents long since spoiled and crystallized, but the labels were still legible. Written in his mother's careful hand, strawberry jam, June 1955. Peach preserves, August 1955. Tomato sauce, September 1955. The last summer before everything fell apart, his mother had been preparing for winter, putting up food, being the kind of provider that women of her generation knew how to be. She'd had no way of knowing that by winter they'd lose everything. Harold carried the jars upstairs and set them on the kitchen counter. He couldn't eat what was inside, but he couldn't throw them away either. They were artifacts of his mother's labor, her care, her hope that there would be a future to preserve food for. As afternoon faded toward evening, Harold attempted to explore the second floor. The stairs creaked alarmingly under his weight, and he took them slowly, testing each step. At the landing, he found 3 doors. He tried the first, his parents' bedroom, a double bed with a metal frame, a dresser, a wardrobe. Everything covered in dust, but preserved as if they'd simply stepped out and never returned. On the dresser sat a framed wedding photo. Raymond in an ill-fitting suit, Estelle in a simple white dress with a small bouquet. Both of them young and hopeful, unaware of what was coming. The second door opened to his room, the one he'd found the previous night. In daylight, he could see more details. The painted animals on the wall, height marks penciled on the doorframe with dates he'd been measured regularly, his growth documented. The last mark read, Harold, age 3, January 1956, 1 month before they'd taken him away. The third door was locked, not with a key lock, but with a heavy, sliding bolt mounted on the outside. Someone had locked this room deliberately, preventing access. Harold tried to force it, but the bolt was solid, and his tools were limited. Whatever was behind that door, someone hadn't wanted it found. Harold returned downstairs as darkness fell. He fed the fire and ate a cold supper of canned beans. Then he sat in one of the armchairs, wrapped in his sleeping bag, and continued reading his mother's journal by flashlight. He found an entry from December 1955 that mentioned the bolt. Raymond installed a lock on the spare room today. He's storing all the documents there, everything related to the property seizure, copies of correspondence, the timeline showing they took the farm illegally. He says, if anything happens to us, there needs to be a record. I told him nothing will happen, but he just shook his head. He doesn't trust Mr. Sutton. Neither do I anymore. So the locked room held evidence. His father had been building a case, documenting the theft of their property, and he'd locked it away to preserve it. Harold needed to get into that room. But not tonight. Tonight, he was exhausted physically from the work, emotionally from the weight of discovery. He closed his eyes, the photograph of his family visible in the firelight. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Harold fell asleep feeling something other than alone. He was home. Not the home he remembered consciously, but the home his body remembered, his heart remembered. The house seemed to breathe around him, settling into the cold night with familiar creaks and groans. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled softly. And Harold slept in the house where he'd been born, where he'd been loved, where his story had begun before it was so cruelly interrupted. Tomorrow, he would continue restoring what had been lost. Tomorrow, he would find a way into that locked room and discover what his father had preserved. Tomorrow, he would take another step toward understanding the truth. But tonight, wrapped in warmth and surrounded by echoes of family, he simply rested. A week passed. Harold fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and right. He woke with the pale winter sun, fed the fire that he kept burning constantly now, and worked until exhaustion forced him to stop. His supplies were running low, but the work sustained him in ways food couldn't. Each day, the house became a little more livable. He'd cleared the main floor of debris, scrubbed surfaces until his hands were raw, replaced broken boards on the porch. The physical labor reminded him of his years at the factory, the satisfaction of fixing things, making them whole again. But it was the locked room upstairs that consumed his thoughts. He'd tried everything he could think of to open it. The bolt was solid steel, secured with screws so rusted they'd become part of the wood. His father had built this lock to last. On the 8th day, Harold decided to walk into town. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed information. If his parents had fought the county's seizure of their property, there had to be records. Someone had to remember what happened. The 3-mile walk felt longer in the cold, but Harold had grown stronger over the week. The work had awakened muscles he'd forgotten he had. At 72, he was learning that the body could still surprise you if you gave it reason to. Millbrook Hollow looked no less desolate in full daylight. Main Street stretched for perhaps 4 blocks, half the storefronts empty with for lease, signs yellowed by sun and time. A handful of cars lined the curb outside the general store. The post office showed a single light in the window. Harold pushed open the door to the general store. A bell chimed overhead. The interior was cramped and dim, shelves stocked with basics, canned goods, bread, milk in a humming cooler. Behind the counter sat a man who had to be in his 70s, reading a newspaper through thick glasses. He looked up when Harold entered. "Help you?" "Need some supplies," Harold said. "And maybe some information." The man studied him with the careful assessment of someone who'd lived in a small town long enough to recognize strangers. "You're the fellow who bought the Mays place." It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in dying towns. "That's right, Harold Mays." The man's expression shifted surprise, then something softer. "Frank Zimmer. I own this place." He stood slowly, arthritis evident in the movement. "Mays, you said?" "I'm Raymond and Estelle's son." Frank's face went still. He came around the counter, moving closer as if he needed to see Harold better. "The boy they lost? The boy the county took?" Frank exhaled slowly. "Lord have mercy. We all wondered what happened to you. You were just a little thing. 3 years old, maybe? Your mama used to bring you in here. You'd point at the candy jars, and she'd let you pick one piece if you'd been good." Harold's chest tightened. Another piece of his past, confirmed by a stranger who'd known him as a child. "What happened to them?" Harold asked. "After they lost the farm?" Frank's expression darkened. "Nothing good. They tried to fight it, your father especially. He went to the county offices every week, trying to prove the seizure was illegal. But Irving Sutton ran things back then. He was county clerk, had his fingers in everything. Raymond couldn't get anyone to listen. And my mother? Estelle was quieter about it, but you could see it eating at her. She'd come in here sometimes, just to be around people, I think. She'd stand in front of those candy jars and cry. After they took you, something broke in her." Harold had to look away. The grief was still too raw. Frank continued, his voice gentle. "They left town eventually, had to. Couldn't afford to stay. Someone said they'd gone north, looking for work. That was early 1957, I think. Never heard from them again." He paused. You came back looking for them? I came back because I had nowhere else to go. I didn't know this was their house until I got here. Frank shook his head slowly. That's something, isn't it? All these years, and you find your way home without even knowing. He moved back behind the counter. Get what you need. We'll settle up when you're done. Harold gathered supplies, more canned goods, matches, batteries, soap. At the counter, Frank tallied the total on a piece of paper. Comes to $43. Harold counted his remaining money. $21. I can pay half now. Can I owe you the rest? Frank waved him off. Pay when you can. Or don't. Your folks were good people. I figure I owe them something. I'll pay, Harold said firmly. But thank you. As Harold packed his purchases into his duffel, Frank said, if you're looking for information about what happened back then, Phyllis Crane at the town hall might help. She's been working there since the 1950 seconds. Saw everything. Never spoke much about it, but she remembers. Harold thanked him and headed for the town hall. The building was small and drafty, heated by a single radiator that clanked and hissed. Behind a desk sat a woman with steel-grey hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked up when he entered, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Can I help you? I'm looking for property records. From 1956. That's a long time ago. What property? The Mays Farm. County Road 47. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. And you are? Harold Mays, Raymond and Estelle's son. She set down her pen slowly. The boy. I'm 72 now, but yes. Phyllis stood and moved to a filing cabinet against the back wall. She pulled out a drawer, fingers moving through files with practiced efficiency. She extracted a thin folder and brought it to the counter. This is what we have. Public record, so you're entitled to see it. Harold opened the folder. Inside were property deed transfers, tax assessments, and a single official notice of seizure. He read through them carefully, his factory-trained mind sorting through the bureaucratic language. The timeline was wrong. According to the original tax notice, his parents had until the 15th of February 1956 to pay. But the seizure was executed January 28, more than 2 weeks early. He pointed this out to Phyllis. She nodded. I was a young clerk then, just started working here. I remember when that happened. Mr. Sutton processed the seizure himself. When I asked about the date discrepancy, he said the board had approved acceleration due to likelihood of non-payment. But I never saw any board meeting minutes about it. So it was irregular. It was a lot of things, Phyllis said carefully. Irving Sutton had considerable authority back then. What he said usually went, who bought the property? Phyllis pulled another sheet. Auction was held the 2nd of February 1956, sold to a private buyer for $800. Well below assessed value. Who was the buyer? She showed him the name. Sutton Holdings, LLC. Harold looked up. Irving Sutton bought it himself? Through a company. Legal, technically, but it raised eyebrows even then. A county clerk seizing property and then purchasing it through a shell company. She paused. People talked quietly, but nobody did anything. Why not? Because Sutton had power. He controlled records, influenced decisions. Anyone who challenged him found themselves having problems, permit denials, tax audits, business license issues. People learned to keep quiet. Harold felt anger building, hot and righteous. My parents lost everything because one man decided he wanted their land. Phyllis's expression was pained. I've worked here 45 years. I've seen a lot of injustices. But what happened to your family was one of the worst. Your father tried to fight it. He filed complaints, gathered evidence. But without money for lawyers and without anyone willing to stand with him, he didn't have a chance. What happened to Irving Sutton? Retired in 1980, died in 1985. His son, Lawrence, runs the family businesses now. He's a developer, owns properties all over the county. Built on stolen land, Harold thought. He thanked Phyllis and left with copies of the records. The walk back to the house felt different. He wasn't just restoring a building anymore. He was uncovering a crime that had destroyed his family and never been answered for. That locked room upstairs suddenly felt more urgent. 2 weeks into his stay, Harold finally managed to remove the door to the locked room. He couldn't break the bolt, so he'd unscrewed the hinges instead, working patiently with his father's old tools. When the door finally came free, he set it carefully against the hallway wall. The room beyond was smaller than the others, barely large enough for a single bed, but it held no furniture. Instead, cardboard boxes lined 3 walls, stacked waist-high and labelled in his father's blocky handwriting. Evidence 1955. Correspondence. Witness statements. Legal research. Harold stood in the doorway, understanding washing over him. His father hadn't just complained about what happened. He'd built a case. Methodically, carefully, he'd documented everything. Harold carried the first box downstairs to better light and warmth. Inside, he found a meticulous record of the farm's finances, ledgers showing every payment made to the county, every tax installment. His father had been behind, yes, but not significantly. And the payments had been consistent until the drought. There were letters too. Raymond writing to the county board, requesting an extension. Writing to the state tax office, asking about appeals processes. Writing to legal aid societies, begging for help he couldn't afford. Most letters had responses clipped to them. Denials. Form letters expressing sympathy but offering no assistance. One response from a lawyer in the state capital. While your case has merit, without significant funds for a retainer, I cannot take this on. I wish you the best. Harold found his mother's recipe box that afternoon, tucked in a kitchen cabinet behind flour tins and sugar containers. The wooden box was simple, handmade, with EM carved into the lid. Inside were recipe cards, written in Estelle's elegant script. He read them one by one. Pot roast with carrots, Sunday chicken, biscuits and gravy. Each card had little notes in the margins. Raymond's favorite, make extra gravy. Harold loves the crispy skin, good for church socials. At the bottom of the box, he found a card that nearly broke him. Harold's birthday cake, written across the top in careful letters. The recipe called for strawberries, vanilla, butter, cream frosting. Below the ingredients, a note. Our boy turns 3 this March. He asks for strawberry every year. His smile when he sees the cake makes all the work worthwhile. Harold sat at the kitchen table, holding the card and imagining his mother's hands writing those words. She'd loved him enough to document his preferences, to make sure his favorite cake would be waiting each birthday. And after they'd taken him, had she made that cake anyway, on his 4th birthday with no child there to eat it? He tried to remember birthday cakes from foster care. There had been some, he supposed. Generic celebrations with whatever children were in the home at the time. Store-bought cakes with stiff frosting. He couldn't remember a single one specifically, but somewhere, buried deep, was the memory of strawberries. He'd always liked them. Harold attempted to make one of the recipes that evening, the pot roast. He had no roast, but he had canned beef and carrots. He followed his mother's instructions as best he could with his limited supplies. The result was edible, if not quite right. But sitting there, eating food made from his mother's recipe in his mother's kitchen felt like a kind of communion. The next morning, he walked back into town. The general store was becoming familiar. Now Frank looked up when Harold entered and nodded in greeting. Need more supplies? Just a few things. And maybe more conversation, if you have time. Frank gestured to a small table near the potbelly stove. Business is slow. I've got time. They sat, and Harold asked the questions that had been building. What did people know about what happened? Were there others who'd lost property the same way? Frank's expression grew thoughtful. There were rumors, other farms that went under in the late 50s, early 60s. Similar circumstances behind on taxes, sudden seizures, sold cheap at auction. But people don't talk about it much. Shame, mostly. Losing your land was seen as personal failure, not theft. But you saw a pattern. Looking back, yes. At the time, we all just thought it was hard times. The drought hit everyone. Farms were failing. It wasn't until years later, when Sutton's holdings kept growing, that some folks started wondering, did anyone ever challenge him? One man tried, farmer named Walter Price. He went to the state attorney general's office in 1962, claimed his farm had been taken illegally. He had documentation, witnesses, the whole thing, but Sutton had connections in the capital. Price's complaint got buried in bureaucracy. He gave up after 2 years of fighting, moved west, died in the 70s, I heard. Harold felt a kinship with Walter Price, another man who'd tried to fight the system and lost. What about my parents? Did they have friends here? People who might remember more? Frank considered. Your mama was friendly with the ladies at church. St. Andrew's, the Lutheran church. Most of them have passed now. But Pastor Yoda might remember, he's been there since the 40s. Old as dirt, but sharp as a tack. Harold found St. Andrew's Lutheran Church on a side street, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple. The door was unlocked. Inside, wooden pews faced a simple altar. Light filtered through plain glass windows. An elderly man was arranging hymnals in the pew racks. He looked up when Harold entered. "Can I help you, son?" "Son." Harold was 72, but to this man, perhaps 90, everyone was young. "I'm looking for Pastor Yoda." "You found him." The pastor straightened slowly, hand pressed to his lower back. "Forgive me. The back isn't what it used to be. I'm Harold Mays. Raymond and Estelle were my parents." The pastor's weathered face transformed. "Little Harold, dear Lord, I baptized you right here." He gestured to the altar. "You were barely a month old. Your mother wore her best dress. Your father held you so carefully, like you might break." Harold's throat tightened. "I don't remember. Of course not. But I do. Your parents were faithful members here. Good people. When they lost the farm, and then lost you, it devastated this whole congregation. We took up a collection to help, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. Do you know what happened to them after they left town?" The pastor's expression grew sad. "I heard they went north, looking for work. Your father wrote me once, maybe 6 months after they left. He said they were struggling but still fighting to get you back. That was the last I heard from them. I wrote back, but the letter was returned undeliverable. They died in 1957. Carbon monoxide poisoning." Pastor Yoda closed his eyes. "God rest their souls." I'd wondered when the letters stopped, but I'd hoped for better news. They sat together in a pew, and the pastor shared memories. Estelle singing in the choir, her voice clear and sweet. Raymond serving as an usher, always early, always dependable. Harold as a toddler, playing quietly during services, sometimes falling asleep in his mother's arms. "They loved you deeply," Pastor Yoda said. "When the county took you, your father came to me asking if God was punishing them. I told him no, that sometimes evil happens through human hands, not divine will. I'm not sure he believed me." Harold left the church with a fuller picture of his parents. They'd been ordinary people, faithful, hard-working, loving. They hadn't deserved what happened to them. That night, back at the house, Harold sat with his father's evidence boxes and his mother's recipes and the family photograph on the mantel. He was starting to understand not just what had been taken from him, but what had been taken from them. A life, a family, a future. And somewhere, someone had profited from that theft. Harold made a decision. He would tell this story. Somehow, he would make sure people knew what Irving Sutton had done. Harold found the medal while searching through his parents' bedroom dresser. It was wrapped in a small American flag, tucked beneath folded clothes that smelled of age and mothballs. The bronze star lay heavy in his palm, the ribbon faded, but the metal still catching the light. He turned it over. Engraved on the back, Sergeant Raymond Mays, European Theatre, 1944. His father had been a war hero. Harold sat on the edge of the bed, holding the medal and feeling anger rise like a tide. Raymond Mays had served his country, fought for freedom, earned recognition for bravery, and that same country had allowed a corrupt clerk to steal his land and destroy his family. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. He carried the medal downstairs and set it beside the family photograph on the mantel. These were his father's legacies, service and love. Both had been betrayed. Harold returned to the evidence boxes with renewed determination. In the second box, he found letters that revealed more of his father's struggle. Raymond had written to his old army unit, asking if anyone knew lawyers who might help. He'd written to veterans' organizations, hoping for support. Most hadn't responded. Those who did expressed sympathy but offered no concrete assistance. One letter stood out. It was from Raymond to a newspaper editor in the state capital, dated March 1956. Harold read it carefully. "Dear editor, I am writing to bring attention to a grave injustice occurring in Millbrook County. As a veteran who served this nation in its hour of need, I now find myself fighting a different kind of enemy corruption in our own government. County Clerk Irving Sutton has systematically seized properties from struggling families, accelerating legal timelines and purchasing these properties through shell companies at fractions of their value. My own farm was taken illegally, 2 weeks before the legal deadline for payment. When I attempted to challenge this, I was threatened with jail. My 3-year-old son was removed from our care on false charges of neglect. I am not the only victim. Others have suffered similarly, but are too afraid or ashamed to speak. I am writing to you because someone must tell this story. Someone must hold power accountable. I have documentation of everything, if you are willing to investigate. Respectfully, Raymond Mays." At the bottom of the letter, stamped in red ink, "Not suitable for publication." Harold stared at those words. His father had tried to go public, tried to expose the truth, and he'd been dismissed. The phone rang. Harold had given the town hall number to Frank as an emergency contact, the only concession he'd made to modern communication. He walked the 3 miles to town to take the call. Phyllis handed him the receiver with an apologetic expression. "It's someone named Gregory." Harold's jaw tightened. He took the phone. "Yes. Where the hell are you?" Gregory's voice was sharp, irritated. "You can't just disappear. I've been trying to find you for 2 weeks. I'm at my house." "What house?" "You don't have a house." "I bought one. The house where I was born, as it turns out." Silence on the other end. Then, "You're being ridiculous. You're 72 years old. You should be in a facility where people can look after you." Harold felt something shift inside him. For 40 years, he'd made himself small around Gregory, trying not to cause conflict, trying to be acceptable. But standing in this town hall, surrounded by records of his father's fight, he found he had no more patience for being diminished. "I'm taking care of myself just fine." "With what money? You had nothing when you left." "I'm managing." "This is foolish. You need to come back. Let me help you find a proper place." "No." The word hung in the air. Harold had never refused Gregory anything before. "Excuse me?" I said no. "I'm not coming back. I'm staying here. You can't survive in some abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. Be reasonable. I've survived worse. And I'm done taking orders from you, Gregory. Your mother was the only thing connecting us, and she's gone. You made it clear I wasn't family when you changed those locks. So don't pretend you care now. But don't call me when it all falls apart. I won't." Harold hung up before Gregory could respond. His hand shook slightly, but not from fear. From liberation. Phyllis looked at him with something like approval. "Good for you." Harold walked back to the house feeling lighter. He'd spent decades trying to earn Gregory's approval, trying to be worthy of a family that had never quite accepted him. No more. He had his own family now, Raymond and Estelle, and their story mattered more than Gregory's opinion ever would. That afternoon, Harold tackled the third floor's locked room with renewed energy. He'd been avoiding damaging the house, but now he decided the truth inside mattered more than preservation. Using a hammer and chisel, he worked at the bolt mounting until the wood splintered and gave way. The door swung open. Inside, the room was exactly as his father had left it. A small desk held a typewriter, ancient even by 1956 standards. Papers covered every surface, organized into careful stacks. File folders lined the walls, each labeled with dates and subjects. Harold began reading. His father had documented everything. Not just his own case, but a pattern stretching back to 1952. 23 families had lost properties under suspicious circumstances during Irving Sutton's tenure as county clerk. 23 farms, homes, businesses, all seized on accelerated timelines, all sold at below-market prices to buyers connected to Sutton. Raymond had interviewed witnesses, collected testimony, traced the money. He'd built an airtight case showing systematic corruption, but he'd never gotten to present it. No lawyer would take it. No newspaper would print it. No official would investigate. The most damning evidence sat in a manila envelope marked "Original Documents." Inside were photocopies of county records that showed forged signatures on payment deferrals, backdated seizure orders, and altered auction dates. Raymond had somehow gotten access to the county's files and documented the fraud. He'd also documented the threats. A log in Raymond's handwriting listed dates and details. The 20th of January, 1956, Sutton approached me outside county office. Said if I keep pushing, I'll lose more than property. Said there are institutions for men who make trouble and orphanages for their children. The 3rd of February, 1956, Deputy Willis stopped me on the road. No reason given. Said Sutton wants me to understand I'm being watched. Harold read through everything twice, his anger building with each page. His father had been right. The seizure had been illegal. The entire system had been rigged. And no one had cared enough to stop it. Harold carried the most important documents downstairs. He laid them out on the dining table, organizing them chronologically. This was a story that needed telling. But how? Raymond had tried and failed. The difference, Harold realized, was timing. Irving Sutton was dead now. He couldn't threaten or intimidate. His son Lawrence might have inherited wealth and influence, but he didn't have the same stranglehold on local power. Maybe, after 70 years, the truth could finally come out. Harold looked at his father's bronze star on the mantel. Raymond had fought for justice twice, once in Europe, once here at home. He'd won the first fight and lost the second. But the fight wasn't over. Harold was his father's son, and he would finish what Raymond had started. Tomorrow, he would begin figuring out how. Tonight, he would honor his father's determination by refusing to give up. Harold carried the evidence boxes to town hall the next morning. Phyllis looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern when she saw what he was hauling. "I need your help," Harold said. "I need to find out what happened to my parents after they left here." Phyllis set down her pen. "What kind of information are you looking for?" "Death records. If they died, there should be certificates." Something flickered across her face. Reluctance, maybe pity. "What years?" 1957 onward, I suppose." Phyllis stood slowly and moved to a different filing cabinet. This one marked "Vital Records." Her fingers moved through folders with practiced efficiency, but Harold noticed her hesitation before she pulled out a thin file. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, handing it to him. Harold opened the file. 2 death certificates, stapled together. His hands began to shake before he'd read past the names. Raymond Mays, Estelle Mays. Date of death, the 14th of February, 1957. Cause, Accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Location: rental cabin, Route 9, Millbrook County. Disposition: buried Potter's Field, Millbrook Cemetery, plots unmarked. Harold had to sit down. The chair creaked under his weight, but he barely heard it. His parents were dead, had been dead for 68 years. All this time, some part of him had held on to hope, however foolish that they might still be alive. Elderly, yes, in their 90s, but alive. That hope died as he stared at the certificates. "I'm so sorry," Phyllis said again. "I should have told you when you first came in, but I didn't know how." Harold's voice came out rough. "Carbon monoxide poisoning. It happened sometimes back then. Faulty heaters in poorly ventilated spaces, especially in cheap rentals." He looked up at her. "Do you believe that?" Phyllis's expression was carefully neutral. "It's what the report says." "That's not what I asked." She hesitated, then moved to another cabinet and pulled out a newspaper archive box. She found what she was looking for quickly, a newspaper clipping from February 1957, yellowed and brittle. "Local couple dies in tragic accident," read the headline. The article was short, buried on page 8. It described Raymond and Estelle Mays, former residents, found deceased in a rented cabin, carbon monoxide from a faulty heater cited as cause. No investigation deemed necessary. Next of kin unknown. Burial in County Potter's Field. Harold noticed the byline. Written by Thomas Sutton. Irving Sutton's brother-in-law ran the newspaper, Phyllis said quietly. He wrote most of the local coverage, so the county clerk whose corruption my father was documenting had his relative write the story about their deaths. I'm not saying anything one way or another. I'm just showing you what's in the public record. But her tone said everything. She had doubts too. Harold read the article again more carefully. It says no investigation was deemed necessary. Who made that determination? County coroner at the time was appointed by the county board. The board chairman in 1957 was, let me guess, someone connected to Irving Sutton. Phyllis nodded. Harold sat back, the pieces falling into place. His parents hadn't just lost their home and their son. They'd been silenced. Whether by accident or design, they died at a convenient time, just as Raymond was building a case that could have exposed decades of corruption. "Where is this Potter's Field?" Harold asked. "Millbrook Cemetery, north section, no markers. The county stopped maintaining it in the 1972nd. Harold gathered the death certificates and the newspaper clipping. "Thank you for your honesty." "Mr. Mays," Phyllis said as he turned to leave, "I was 23 years old when I started working here. Irving Sutton scared me. He scared everyone. I saw things I should have spoken up about, and I didn't. I've regretted it for 45 years. You're helping now. It's too late for your parents, but not too late for the truth." Harold walked to Millbrook Cemetery. It sat on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by a rusted iron fence. The maintained sections held neat rows of headstones, some dating back to the 1800s. But the north section was overgrown, choked with weeds and scrub brush that had grown unchecked for decades. He pushed through the undergrowth until he found the area that must be Potter's Field. No markers at all, just uneven ground, where the earth had settled over coffins. Somewhere in this forgotten corner, his parents lay in unmarked graves. Harold stood there for a long time, the February wind cutting through his coat. He'd spent his whole life thinking they'd abandoned him. Now he knew they'd fought for him until they had nothing left, and then they died alone and unmourned, buried like criminals or paupers. "I'm sorry," he said aloud to the frozen ground. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I couldn't help you. I'm sorry it took me 70 years to find you." His voice broke on the last words. He knelt in the snow, pressing his palm against the earth. "But I'm here now, and I'm going to make this right. I promise you that. Everyone will know what happened. Everyone will know you didn't give up, you didn't fail, you were stolen from, and then you were silenced. But your story won't end in this forgotten corner. I swear it." He stayed there until the cold became unbearable, then walked back to Town Hall. Phyllis looked up when he entered, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. "I need one more thing," Harold said. "What happened to Irving Sutton's properties after he died?" "They passed to his son, Lawrence Sutton. He's a developer now. Owns shopping centers, apartment complexes. One of the wealthiest men in the county. Built on what his father stole." Phyllis didn't argue. "Does Lawrence know how his father acquired those initial properties?" "I couldn't say. He was only 10 years old in 1956, but he spent his whole life benefiting from it." Harold nodded slowly. The anger he'd been feeling crystallized into something sharper, more focused. This wasn't just about exposing Irving Sutton anymore. It was about confronting a legacy of theft that continued to this day. "Do you have contact information for Lawrence Sutton?" "Mr. Mays." "I'm not sure that's wise. I'm not going to threaten him. But he needs to know that someone remembers. Someone knows what his father did." Phyllis wrote down an address and phone number. "His office is in the city, but he has a house here in town, the biggest one on Elm Street. You can't miss it." Harold took the information and left. He walked back to his house with new clarity. This wasn't a story about finding his parents anymore. It was a story about justice for the dead and accountability for the living. His father had tried to fight alone and failed, but Harold wouldn't be alone. He had Raymond's evidence, Phyllis's cooperation, and the simple fact that time had removed the man who'd terrified everyone into silence. The truth could come out now, and Harold would make sure it did. Phyllis arrived at Harold's house 2 days later, just after sunset. He saw her car pull up the long driveway, headlights cutting through the gathering dark. She knocked softly, and when Harold opened the door, she looked nervous. "I shouldn't be here," she said. "But I couldn't stop thinking about your parents." Harold stepped aside to let her in. The house was warmer now, the fire burning steadily. He'd made real progress. The main floor was clean, livable. The family photograph sat prominently on the mantel beside Raymond's bronze star. Phyllis noticed them immediately. "I remember them," she said softly. "They used to come into the county office together. Your mother would wait on the bench while your father tried to talk to Sutton. She always looked so worried. You said you saw things back then, things you should have spoken up about." She nodded. "There's something else, something I've never told anyone." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small key. "When I started working at the county office, part of my job was filing. There was a storage room in the basement where old records were kept. Evidence from closed cases, confiscated items, things like that. Each item had a number and a key." She held up the key. "I was going through the old ledgers last night after you left. Your father filed an official complaint in March 1956. It was assigned case number 127. I found the locker number in the ledger, but the case file itself was marked as lost. Lost or destroyed. The ledger just says lost. But this key was still in the key box, which means whatever was in that locker might still be there." Harold felt his pulse quicken. "Can we check?" "Not during business hours, but I still have access to the building." She glanced at her watch. "Everyone's gone home by now." They drove to Town Hall in Phyllis's car. She parked behind the building and used her key to enter through the back door. Inside, the building was dark and silent. Phyllis led him down a narrow staircase to the basement. The storage room was cramped and musty, lined with metal lockers that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Phyllis counted along the rows until she found number 127. The key turned with difficulty, but the lock finally gave. Inside the locker sat a cardboard box and a larger item wrapped in cloth. Phyllis pulled out the box first. Harold opened it carefully. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape recorder and a single tape, labeled in his father's handwriting. "Raymond Mays Testimony March, 1956. Harold's hands shook as he lifted the tape. He recorded testimony. "There's more," Phyllis said, unwrapping the cloth. Inside were photographs Raymond's face, showing bruises along his jaw and a cut above his eye. Another photo showed his father's truck with a smashed headlight and dented fender. "He documented abuse," Harold said. At the bottom of the box was a witness statement, signed by a neighbor. Harold read it quickly. The neighbor had seen 3 men, one of them Deputy Willis, following Raymond's truck one night. The next morning, Raymond's truck was damaged, and he had bruises. The witness statement was dated the 10th of March 1956 and notarized, but clipped to it was another document, a retraction, dated March 12, stating the witness had been mistaken and withdrawn the complaint. The signature on the retraction didn't match the signature on the original statement. "They forged the retraction," Harold said. "I told you," Phyllis said quietly. "Irving Sutton controlled everything. They found an old reel-to-reel player in an office upstairs." Phyllis threaded the tape with practiced hands, and they listened together in the dark. Raymond's voice came through scratchy but clear. He spoke calmly, methodically, laying out his case. He described the timeline of the seizure, the discrepancies in the paperwork, Sutton's threats. Then his voice changed, becoming rawer. "They took my son. Harold is 3 years old. He doesn't understand why strangers came and took him away from his parents. The caseworker said we're unfit because we lost our house, but we lost our house because it was stolen from us. Now they're using that theft to justify taking our boy. This isn't justice. This is cruelty backed by official paperwork." The tape crackled with silence for a moment. Then Raymond continued, his voice steadier but filled with determination. "I'm making this recording because I know what happens to people who challenge men like Irving Sutton. I know I might not get to tell this story myself, but someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know what happened here. My son needs to know we didn't abandon him. We fought for him. We're still fighting for him. And if anything happens to us, I want him to know we loved him. That's the most important thing. Harold, if you ever hear this, we loved you. Every single day." The tape ended. Harold sat in the darkness, his father's voice still echoing in his ears. Phyllis was crying quietly beside him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't help them. You were young. You were scared. I understand. I should have been braver." Harold put his hand over hers. "You're being brave now." They copied everything, the tape, the photographs, the documents. Phyllis kept the originals safe in the locker, but Harold took copies home. Evidence his father had preserved, waiting 70 years to be heard. Over the next few days, Frank helped Harold connect with other elderly residents who remembered the 1,950 seconds. One by one, they came to Harold's house. 5 people, all in their 70s or 80s, all with stories of families who'd lost property under suspicious circumstances during Irving Sutton's tenure. They sat around Harold's dining table, sharing memories that had been buried by shame and fear for decades. A woman named Dorothy, whose parents lost their home in 1958. A man named George, whose uncle's business was seized in 1960. Each story followed the same pattern: manufactured crises, accelerated seizures, below-market sales to Sutton-connected buyers. "Why didn't anyone speak up back then?" Harold asked. "We tried," George said. "My uncle went to the state attorney general, filed a formal complaint. It got buried in paperwork for 2 years, then dismissed for lack of evidence. By then, my uncle, he had moved to Ohio. He died never getting justice. They decided together to make their stories public. Dorothy suggested contacting a reporter she'd read about in the state capitol, an investigative journalist named Kendra Finch, who specialized in historical corruption cases. Harold called from the town hall phone the next day. Kendra answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sharp and interested when Harold explained what he had. "I can be there tomorrow," she said. This is exactly the kind of story that needs telling. She arrived the following afternoon, a woman in her 40s with a digital recorder and a notebook. Harold showed her everything: his father's evidence, the tape, the death certificates, the witness testimonies from the other families. She listened to Raymond's recording twice, taking notes continuously. "This is substantial," she said. "Your father built an airtight case. The question is, do we have enough to go after Lawrence Sutton? His fortune was built on what his father stole, but he was a child then. Legally, he's not responsible for his father's crimes. But morally?" Kendra smiled grimly. "Morally is a different story, and that's the story I write, the article published online at midnight." Harold didn't see it until morning when Phyllis called him to the town hall. She'd printed it out, and they read it together at her desk. "Buried Truths: How One County Clerk Built a Fortune on Stolen Land," read the headline. Kendra had written with precision and power, laying out the evidence methodically. Raymond's testimony formed the backbone of the story. The other families' accounts provided corroboration. She'd included photographs: the Mays family portrait, Raymond's bruised face, copies of forged documents. The article named Irving Sutton clearly and traced how his initial thefts had been parlayed into holdings now worth millions, all controlled by his son Lawrence. "She didn't hold back," Phyllis said. By noon, Harold's phone, the town hall line, was ringing constantly. Other families calling with similar stories. Reporters from regional newspapers requesting interviews. Someone from the state attorney general's office asking for copies of the evidence. At 2 o'clock, a courier arrived with a legal envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Sutton and Associates law firm, representing Lawrence Sutton. The letter demanded immediate retraction of all statements, public apology, and threatened legal action for defamation, libel, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It stated that Irving Sutton had acted lawfully within his authority as county clerk, and that these allegations damaged Lawrence Sutton's reputation and business interests. Harold read it twice, then set it down calmly. "Are you worried?" Phyllis asked. "No. Everything in that article is true and documented. Truth isn't defamation." At 4 o'clock, a lawyer arrived at the house. Expensive suit, leather briefcase, the kind of man who charged by the minute. Harold met him on the porch. "Mr. Mays, I represent Lawrence Sutton. My client is prepared to be generous if you'll cooperate." "Generous how?" "A financial settlement, enough to make you comfortable. In exchange, you retract your statements and sign a non-disclosure agreement." "How much?" The lawyer named a figure that would have seemed impossible to Harold a month ago, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. "No," Harold said. The lawyer blinked. "You haven't heard the full offer. I don't need to. My parents died fighting for the truth. I won't sell it now. Mr. Mays, you're an elderly man with no resources. A legal battle will destroy you financially and personally. My client has unlimited resources and every incentive to fight this." "Then let him fight. I've already been destroyed once. I survived. I'll survive again." The lawyer's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. You have no idea what you're up against." "I know exactly what I'm up against. The same thing my father faced. The difference is, your client's father isn't around to threaten and intimidate anymore. So, tell Mr. Sutton that I'm not retracting anything. The truth stands." The lawyer left, and Harold felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. His father would have been proud of that moment. Kendra published a follow-up article that evening, focusing on the legal threats. The story spread faster now. Social media picked it up, though Harold barely understood what that meant. What he did understand was that public opinion was shifting in his favor. Comments poured in, expressing outrage at the Sutton family's attempts to silence the truth. The next morning, Lawrence Sutton himself arrived. Harold was in the yard, splitting wood, when a black Mercedes pulled up the driveway. A man in his late 60s stepped out, dressed in casual but expensive clothes. His face was tight with controlled anger. "Mr. Mays." Mr. Sutton. They faced each other across the woodpile. Lawrence looked at the house, taking in the repairs Harold had made, the smoke rising from the chimney. "My father built this county," Lawrence said. "He took worthless properties from people who couldn't maintain them and turned them into productive assets. He created jobs, developed infrastructure, made this place better. He stole from desperate families and got rich doing it. Your parents couldn't keep their farm. That's tragic, but it's not theft. Your father accelerated the seizure timeline illegally. He bought the property through a shell company. He threatened my father and had him beaten. He took their child to punish them for resisting. Then they conveniently died before they could present their evidence. That's not tragedy. That's corruption and possibly murder." Lawrence's jaw tightened. "You have no proof of murder." "I have suspicious timing and a relative of your father's writing the only news coverage. I have a case that was buried and evidence that was hidden. Maybe you didn't know what your father did, but you've built your life on what he stole. That makes you responsible for making it right. I don't owe you anything. You owe my parents. You owe every family your father destroyed. This is pointless." Lawrence turned back toward his car, then stopped. "My lawyers will crush you in court. You're wasting your time and what little life you have left. Maybe, but people know the truth now. That's what my father wanted. That's what I wanted. Everything else is just details." Lawrence got in his car and drove away, tires spitting gravel. Harold watched him go, then went back to splitting wood. His hands were steady. That evening, Phyllis came by with news. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation. They're looking into all property seizures during Irving Sutton's tenure. Will they find anything? Your father already did the work. They just have to follow his documentation. Harold sat on the porch, watching the sun set through the pines. He thought about his father in this same spot 70 years ago, fighting a battle that seemed impossible. Raymond hadn't won, but he'd preserved the evidence, kept the truth alive, trusted that someday someone would listen. That someone was Harold. The phone rang inside. Phyllis answered it, then came to the door. "It's Kendra. She says there's been a development." Harold took the call. Kendra's voice was excited. 3 more families just came forward with evidence. And Lawrence Sutton's business partners are distancing themselves publicly. One of them released a statement saying they had no knowledge of the origin of Sutton's initial holdings. "The pressure is working." Harold thanked her and hung up. He stood on the porch of his childhood home, the house he'd bought for $99, the house that had given him back his history. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, victory seemed possible. 3 days after the confrontation with Lawrence Sutton, a woman in a grey suit arrived at Harold's door. She showed him credentials, identifying her as Assistant Attorney General Patricia Voss. "May I come in?" Harold led her to the dining table, where his father's evidence was still spread out. Patricia spent an hour examining everything, the documents, the tape recording, the photographs. She took notes, asked precise questions, and listened to Raymond's testimony twice. "This is substantial," she finally said. "Your father was meticulous. Most of what he documented can be verified through state archives. Can you prosecute?" "Irving Sutton is deceased. We can't prosecute a dead man. But we can investigate the broader pattern and address civil implications. Families who lost property may have grounds for compensation claims. More importantly, the historical record will be corrected." "What about Lawrence Sutton?" Patricia chose her words carefully. "He inherited property that was improperly seized. Whether he knew about the circumstances is difficult to prove. He was 10 years old in 1956. But we'll be looking at his entire business history. If there are irregularities in how he's operated since taking over his father's holdings, we'll find them." She stood to leave, then paused. "Your father's work here, it's extraordinary. He built a case that would hold up in court today. Most people would have given up. He had something worth fighting for. So do you, apparently." After Patricia left, Harold walked into town. The story had transformed Millbrook Hollow. Reporters had been through, conducting interviews. The town council held an emergency meeting about their historical records. People Harold had never met stopped him on the street to share their own family stories of loss during the 1,950 seconds. At the general store, Frank had the state newspaper spread on the counter. "You're on the front page again." The headline read, "State launches investigation into historic property seizures." The article detailed Patricia's visit and quoted her saying the investigation would be comprehensive. It also mentioned that several of Lawrence Sutton's business partners had quietly begun dissolving their associations with him. "Public pressure works," Frank said. "Lawrence built his reputation on being respectable, connected. That reputation is crumbling." That evening, Gregory called. Harold almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "I saw the news," Gregory said. His voice was different, uncertain, without its usual edge. "About your family." "Your real family?" "Yes. I didn't know." "About any of it?" "You never asked." Silence stretched between them. Then Gregory said, "I watched your interview, the one you did with that reporter. You talked about your parents and what they went through. You looked, I don't know, like you finally belonged somewhere." Harold didn't respond. There was nothing to say. "I was wrong," Gregory continued, "about making you leave, about a lot of things. My mother loved you, and I was too busy being angry at her for remarrying to see that. I'm sorry." The apology landed between them, inadequate but genuine. "I appreciate that," Harold said. "But I'm not coming back." "I know. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I accept your apology. But this is where I belong now. In my parents' house." After they hung up, Harold sat by the fire, processing the conversation. Gregory's apology didn't undo the hurt, but it closed something that had needed closing. He could let Gregory go now without bitterness, just as someone you waved to from a departing train, connected once but moving in different directions. The next day brought a town meeting. Not the official council, but a gathering organized by citizens who remembered the 1,950 seconds or had heard family stories about that time. More than 100 people crowded into the community center. Harold stood at the front, uncomfortable being the center of attention, but understanding it was necessary. He introduced the other families who'd come forward, Dorothy, George, and 3 others who'd arrived after Kendra's article. Each told their story. Each story followed the same pattern of manipulation and theft. When they finished, Pastor Yoda stood. "I've served this community for 70 years. I've stayed quiet about many things I shouldn't have. But this moment calls for truth-telling. We all knew something wasn't right back then. We all suspected Irving Sutton was corrupt. But we were afraid, or we convinced ourselves it wasn't our business. We failed these families. The least we can do now is acknowledge what happened and ensure it's remembered." Someone called for a vote on installing a memorial in the town square, a monument listing the families who'd lost property during those years. The motion passed unanimously. Harold felt something ease in his chest. This was what his father had wanted, not revenge, but recognition. Not to destroy the Sutton family, but to tell the truth plainly and let it stand in the light. As people filed out, a man Harold didn't recognize approached him. Well-dressed, probably in his early 60s. "Mr. Mays, I'm Warren Phillips. I was a business partner of Lawrence Sutton's." Was being the operative word. Harold waited. "I severed all business ties with him yesterday. I didn't know about his father's history, and I don't want to be associated with that legacy. But I wanted you to know something. Lawrence is planning to make a statement." "What kind of statement?" "He's going to cooperate with the state investigation. His lawyers told him to fight, but his children convinced him otherwise. They don't want to inherit a tainted legacy. Sometimes the next generation has to clean up their parents' mistakes." Warren handed Harold a business card. "If you need anything, legal help, financial support, call me." What was done to your family was wrong. Some of us want to help make it right." After Warren left, Harold stood on the community center steps, looking at the small town spread before him. A month ago, he'd arrived here with nothing, no family, no home, no future. Now he stood at the center of something that felt like community, like purpose, like justice, slowly bending toward truth. The fight wasn't finished. The investigation would take time. The memorial would take planning. But the hardest part was done. The silence was broken. His parents' story was no longer buried in forgotten corners and unmarked graves. It lived now, in public memory, where it belonged. Harold walked home through the cold February evening, toward the house that had been stolen and reclaimed, toward the fire burning in the hearth, toward the family photograph on the mantel. Toward home. Spring arrived slowly, melting snow revealing ground that hadn't seen sun in months. Harold stood in the garden plot behind the house, turning soil that his father had once worked. The earth was rich and dark, ready for planting. 3 months had passed since he'd bought the house for $99. In that time, everything had changed. The state investigation had confirmed what Raymond documented 70 years ago. 23 families received formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing and modest compensation from a fund Lawrence Sutton had established. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was recognition. It was justice, however delayed. Lawrence had made a public statement, carefully worded by lawyers, but genuine enough. He acknowledged his father's actions, expressed regret, and committed to making amends. His business empire had contracted significantly, partners fleeing the tainted association. Harold didn't feel sorry for him. Some legacies demanded a price. The town square monument was unveiled in April. Simple granite with bronze lettering, listing the 23 families and the years they'd lost their properties. At the top, in larger letters, "In memory of those who lost everything, but never lost their dignity." Raymond and Estelle Mays were the first names listed. The dedication ceremony was small but meaningful. Pastor Yoda led a prayer. Dorothy read a poem her mother had written years ago about loss and resilience. Harold stood quietly, his parents' names now permanently etched in stone where everyone could see them. After the ceremony, Harold had driven to Millbrook Cemetery with Frank and Phyllis. The county had installed proper headstones in the potter's field, simple markers with names and dates. Harold stood before his parents' graves, no longer unmarked and forgotten. "I kept my promise," he said to the earth beneath his feet. "Everyone knows your story now. Everyone knows you fought. You didn't fail. You never failed." He'd placed flowers there, daisies, like the ones pressed in the family Bible. Now, in his garden, Harold planted tomatoes and beans and peppers. His mother's mason jars sat on the kitchen counter, cleaned and ready for this year's harvest. He would fill them with vegetables he'd grown in the soil his parents had tended. The circle would complete itself. The house was fully restored now. Frank and several others from town had helped with repairs. Harold couldn't manage alone. New shingles on the roof, windows replaced, paint that would last another decade. Inside, he'd furnished it simply a mix of the original furniture, carefully restored, and a few new pieces. The family photograph still held its place on the mantel beside Raymond's bronze star. Harold had added another frame, a copy of Kendra's article, not from pride, but as proof that truth could survive even when buried for decades. Margaret's wedding ring sat in a small box on his dresser. He'd made his peace with that part of his life. She'd given him stability when he needed it most. He would always be grateful. But this house, this place, was where he truly belonged. On his 73rd birthday, Harold made his mother's strawberry cake using her recipe card. It wasn't perfect, the frosting was lumpy, and the layers weren't quite even, but it tasted like memory and love and home. Frank, Phyllis, Dorothy, George, and Pastor Yoda came for a small celebration. They sang Happy Birthday while Harold closed his eyes and made a wish. "Let them know I found my way home." When he blew out the candles, He felt certain somehow they did know. His parents' presence filled this house not as ghosts, but as foundation. Everything he did here honored their memory, the garden, the repairs, the simple act of living in the home they'd built with love. The compensation money from the state fund had been modest, but Harold used part of it to establish something that mattered. The Raymond and Estelle Mays Education Fund would provide scholarships for children in foster care. Small amounts, but enough to help with books or supplies or application fees. Enough to show someone that they weren't forgotten, that someone believed in their future. It was what his parents would have wanted, taking their pain and transforming it into possibility for others. As evening fell on his birthday, Harold sat in the rocking chair his father had built, positioned on the newly repaired porch. He opened his mother's journal to the first page and began reading again, not with sorrow now, but with gratitude. The words were the same, the joy of expecting a child, the hope for the future, the simple love of a young family starting out. But Harold heard them differently now. Not as evidence of loss, but as proof of connection that survived everything, even death, even decades of separation. He read until darkness made the words impossible to see, then closed the journal gently and sat watching stars emerge over the pines. Somewhere in the house, wood settled with a familiar creak. The wind moved through the eaves with a sound that was almost like singing. Harold thought about the journey that had brought him here from that frozen road with nothing but a duffel bag and $99 to this moment of peace on his parents' porch. Sometimes the longest journey was the one back to yourself, and sometimes, if you were lucky, you found you were never really lost at all, just waiting to be found. He stood slowly, his joints protesting less than they had 3 months ago. The work had made him stronger, purpose had made him whole. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. Harold added wood and watched flames catch and grow. The house warmed around him, sheltering him as it had when he was 3 years old, as it would for whatever years remained to him. He was home. Finally, truly home. And that was enough.